Hello everyone, this is your chess friend here. Today I'll be showing you how to practically use every single of your pieces. I won't be talking about the pawns because there's so much to do with your pawns that I can make an entire another video out of them. And I'll be briefly mentioning the king because he really doesn't have that much of a role besides to be protected. So let's jump into our first example, which are our knights and our bishops. So knights move in an L shape. They go 2 squares up, 1 square to the left. So they move in L's like this. They're good in closed spaces because they can jump over pieces like these pawns here. But they have a disadvantage that they move slowly across the entire board. Bishops, on the other hand, are very long-range pieces that only move by diagonals, but they can move as far as they want by those diagonals. So they could go all the way to a3 if they wanted in a single move. Anyway, those are going to be the first pieces that we're going to be covering. So here I'll show you how a bishop can be superior to a knight in an endgame-like scenario. So here, first thing you can notice is that both players have the same amount of material. One 3-point piece, which is a minor piece, knights and bishops. 4 pawns. White's pawns are more separated. You can see the pawn on d5 is isolated, meaning it has no pawns next to it on either file, but it's also a few squares only from promotion. Here, black played from bishop f3 to black played the bishop from f3 to d1, and you can see how powerful the bishop is in this scenario. Because the board is so open, black's bishop can simply zip around the whole board, capturing all the pawns, while white's knight is going to need a lot more moves to do anything. So white here played knight to e4, trying to capture a pawn, and you can see how powerful the bishop is. It already captured a pawn. Knight captured a pawn on g5, and the bishop captured on a4. So black is already up a pawn, and if white wants to recapture on h4, he needs to play knight to f3 and knight to h4. And in that time, black can play bishop to d7 and bishop takes on h3. So in 2 moves, white can capture this pawn, which is right next to his knight, and black can capture this pawn, which is on the complete other side of the board. So in these open scenarios, it's much easier for black to capture pawns and move around the entire board than the white knight can. But if there was only play on one side of the board, it would be much better for the white knight, because the white knight is good at moving through complex places with lots of pawns everywhere, lots of squares that aren't able to move to, while the black bishop is much better at just getting around the entire board and helping on both sides. So here, white's knight was trying to capture these pawns on, the B and A pawns, but you can easily see how long it took white to do that. So the white king moved to g2 to stop bishop capturing on h3. That's an okay move, but again, white really doesn't have time for that. Here, the pawns kind of bully the knight, going back and forth, and the bishop has to move to f5 and attack the knight. Otherwise, when the pawn moves, the knight can capture it, and then if the other pawn chooses to move, the knight can capture it again. So it is important to have your bishop helping your passed pawns. Actually, one more thing to mention is how active of a defender pieces are. Bishops and knights are very good blockaders, because this bishop is blocking the d6 pawn, not letting it move forward, but it's also incredibly active. It can cover still 11 squares, even though it's completely blocked from one side, because a bishop only moves by diagonals. It doesn't really care what's directly in front of it. Knights are also really active defenders. If this was a knight instead of a bishop, maybe with something like this, and the knight was here, then it would still have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 squares, because a knight also doesn't care what's directly in front of it. It can be a very active defender, blockader, sorry. So here, even though the knight's blockading this pawn, it's still able to move to the same 3 squares as if it wasn't blockading the pawn, while queens and rooks get kind of cut off when they're blocking something. So then the bishop moved, and at this point, black is just easily winning. So for our next example, I'll be showing you a position where the knights are actually better than bishops, and that's in a position like this. As you can see, black's bishops they have many squares, but they're all being covered by pawns because this is a closed position. This means that both players don't really have many squares available to them. Many of them are just blocked by pawns. So, in fact, black's own pawns blockade his own bishop. No matter where he goes, he really isn't very active. While white's knights, they can still cover good squares. They can easily maneuver around. If white had enough moves, he could go knight to f2, knight to g4, pressure the pawn. He can move his other knight around. So basically, even without all these openings, white can easily still maneuver his knights around, while the black bishops are very weak here. So black's main job in a closed position like this is to play moves like c6, try to open up the position, maybe try something like this, if he could. Just trying to open up the bishops, open up the position, and try to bring it more into this position like we saw here. The next piece we're going to be talking about is rooks. So if we go back to our board here, I can show you how rooks move. Rooks move on horizontal and vertical. Well, rooks move along the ranks and the files. The files are like the A file, the B file, the C file, the D file. That's what we call the letters, sorry. And the numbers are the ranks. So we've got the 7th rank, which is the 7 number. We've got the 2nd rank, which is the 2nd number. We have the 5th rank, which is the 5 number, and so on and so forth. So the rooks, basically, they can move to any of these squares and any of these squares. So the rook can go here, it can go up, this rook can move, and that's how rooks move. They move on vertical and horizontal lines. They move on the ranks and the files. And rooks are usually late game pieces, as you can see in this example here. In this example, you'll be seeing a very powerful rook, which is white's rook, and a very passive rook, which is black's rook. Here, the black rook is stuck defending this pawn, while the white rook is not only blockading the pawn, but also threatening to capture all these pawns on the sides. A good tip for if you're using rooks is to not put them directly behind the pawn. If the rook was instead on this square, it could not only defend the pawn, but also capture the e3 pawn later. Here, white's rook is not only blocking the pawn and threatening it, he's also capturing threatening to capture all these pawns, and it's tying down the rook. So from here, it was black to move. So the black king went to b7, trying to stop rook takes b6, but that's fine because the rook can take on the other sides. So they kept playing a little bit. And from here, it's pretty simple. White changed his advantage of having a more active rook into an advantage of 2 pawns up. So from here, traded pawns, and from here, it's quite simple. The king has to move up, and white can slowly push his pawns till he gets another queen. And black can't really do anything here because not only is his king cut off, but the rook can't move to the 2nd rank where it would be quite powerful. So in this example, you saw how a good rook and a bad rook can work. Here's another situation where the black rook moved to d2, which is a very good square. The entire 2nd rank is very good for rooks because that's where the pawns start, and that's usually where there are still some pawns to be captured. And in this position, black could have played rook e8 or maybe, in this position, black traded the pawn. So black was up a pawn, but he let white recapture it in order to get such a powerful rook that could go around eating all of white's pawns. So white gave a check, but it doesn't really do anything. And then black simply could capture all of white's pawns. And from here, it's quite, well, so basically, I think white made a little mistake here. Yeah, sorry. Should have played a5. Anyway, from this position, black's not only up a pawn, but he's quickly going to gain more material and easily win the game. So this is a good rook again. This time it was black's rook that was quite active here. And sometimes it's even worth trading a pawn to get a very active piece like this rook. Next, I'm going to be showing you a couple of situations where the queen is powerful. Where the queen is very useful. The queens are very good attacking pieces and not very good defending pieces. Your best defending pieces are your knights and your bishops. One second. Your knights and your bishops are great at defending. Rooks are very bad at defending for a few reasons, mostly because they're very valuable. The more valuable a piece, the worse it is at defending, because you want your defenders to be able to trade into your attackers, because if you can trade off all of your attackers, then there isn't going to be an attack. So queens can move by diagonals, verticals, and horizontals. So the queen is the easiest moving piece in the board, with a lot of squares it can go to. So the queen can take on d5 even. So basically the queen is a combination of the bishop and, the bishop and the rook, making it worth a little over, making it worth 9 points. So here I'll be showing you a quick example where the queen is a very powerful attacker. So here black went knight to h5, trying to trade off the bishop, and black got a very nice so black could have gone to g3 and allowed the knight to take, but that would be giving black the two bishops advantage, and instead black found a very nice tactic with knight takes on g5. F takes g5, bishop. From here, the queen can take on d5 because there's not only a check, but it also allows bishop takes g5 next turn, saving the bishop and gaining a knight. So from here, it's already, I think, winning. Yeah, from here, it's already better for white because white's up an extra pawn. But in a couple moves after bishop g6, queen takes g5, white is now up two pawns, and they're both very key defenders of the black king. So I'm not going to be talking about pawns too much in this episode because pawns are very important in chess, and I can make an entire video. So if you want a video about just pawns, you can let me know. I'll tell you much more in detail about what pawns are useful for. But mainly, white's definitely not going to be wanting to castle kingside anymore because you'll have no defense. So knight goes to c6, trying to keep developing, hopefully maybe bringing it over to the king side to help with the defense. Bishop to d3, trying to trade off. So sometimes if white only has a couple of defenders near the king side, like that bishop, his bishops and the rook, it's okay to use an undeveloped piece to try to trade it off so that your attackers have more of an impact. That's what white did here. Queen to d7 is an okay move. Queen delivered a check. So basically that move was to help black have an escape square. Knight to c3, trying to develop, maybe bring another attacker into the attack, really. Knight to c2, trying to fork the king and the rook or take the pawn, which isn't exactly isn't wonderful here. I would suggest black to stop trying to attack and more defending. Well, it's clear here that if one player is going to be winning, it's going to be white, especially because he's already up material. It's not very good to catapult yourself into an attack that you definitely can't sustain because whites just have too much of an attack going. So white castled, black took a pawn, white took a pawn because there's a defender of the queen. c6, okay move, attacking the knight and also giving an escape score for the king. But black missed knight to f6. Knight to f6 is a very good move. It allows, if the pawn captures, then the bishop can capture with a double attack, forcing king to c8, and white's going to win that way. But if instead of capturing the pawn, white plays... well, white's queen is in danger, so white's going to have to play something along the lines of queen to d6, allowing queen f7 check, winning a rook. So clearly this is much better for white, and the queen was very important to the attack, along with the knights and the bishops. So a queen by itself won't be able to win the attack, so there isn't many scenarios that I can show you where a single queen is going to be attacking, because to attack in chess you need more than one piece. You're going to need at least 3, maybe 4 for a solid attack, but sometimes 2 pieces can do it, but that's quite rare. So second to last game I'm going to be showing you is a quick one where we see another queen being very powerful. This is just a simple opening, but here, when the knight went to e4, white got a little bit greedy and decided to go move his e1 rook, which was not great. Well, it develops the rook with a defense on the pawn, but he should have played d3 because it really weakens the f2 square at a time where the f2 square crucially couldn't be weak. If white had played h3, then it would have been okay to go king e1, but here, after knight g4, the f2 square is in grave danger. So rook went to e2, trying to defend the f2 square, and f5 crushes through. This move is very good because it not only opens up the rook's file later in the game, but also it trades off a central pawn and lets you move e4 later in the game. So sometimes it's good to sacrifice a pawn like this if you know you're going to be getting it back soon, or if you know you're going to be getting something better. And here you're getting something much better. So black would like to castle here, but unfortunately the bishop here would deliver a check to the king when it was on g8. So instead, black has to find a move that can either stop the bishop from defending the king, or from stopping the check, or to capture the bishop. Can you see the move here? It's actually d5, so you might have gotten it right. Comment if you did. Bishop goes to b5. Anywhere the bishop goes is okay, but anyway, castling. Bishop takes on c6, trying to gain a tempo, but actually that doesn't work, because after e4, the knight's in danger and the bishop's in danger, so white has to choose which one to save. Although it's okay, because white is up a piece already. He captured the knight here. But as soon as he takes on d5, the queen can recapture. And now there's still this threat here, so the knight's going to be having to move. So knight to c3 is a great in-between move. An in-between move is a move that you can make before dealing with a threat or before taking a piece that has enough of an impact to the point where your opponent can't ignore it. So here, obviously, black can't just take the knight because he'll lose his queen. And even if he takes a rook here, it's still not worth it because you're trading a knight, a rook, and a pawn for a queen. Because you can't recapture the knight, and white can recapture the pawn. So that would be trading 10 points for 8 points, which is not a good exchange. So here, it had enough of an impact that black couldn't ignore it and take with the knight. But black did have another in-between move that he could play before taking the pawn on f5 to retreat the queen. So black's in-between move was knight to f2, which you could capture, but after knight captures on d1, you have a bit of a dilemma. If you capture, well, first off, you can't capture this knight, and it's going to be taking some pieces later. Also, you have this knight under attack. Also, you have this pawn under attack. So white's position just really isn't solid enough for a queen trade under these circumstances. So rook had to take on f2. Bishop took on f2 with check. King had to take on f2 because it was a check. They couldn't ignore it. And the queen takes on f3. From here, it's quite easy to tell, but I'll move a couple moves. The pawn was always going to take the knight. There's a pin, so you can't stop it in any way, except for knight takes e4, which doesn't really help, does it? So the king had to move away, try to be a little safer, and the pawn takes, queen takes. And from here, it's quite obvious black's going to win this game, in part because of his very powerful attack, but The queen's most likely going to get traded. If they don't, it's not going to be difficult for black to force it. In fact, I think white actually might want a queen trade here because of how weak the king is. It's already at the point where any check is a loss because the queen is covering all of white's escape squares. Even if that wasn't the case, white is up, black is up the rook for the knight exchange. So this is quite a simple win for black from here. So that shows you the power of the queen. And the last piece we have on this board to talk about is the king. The king is it's a weak piece because you can't trade it for anything. It's an awful defender because it's not going to be traded for anything. Like I said earlier, the more valuable the piece, the worse it is because you can't really trade it. Well, the worse it is for defending. The higher the value of the piece, usually it's better for attacking. So king to the king is an exception because you don't want to be attacking with your king. You're never going to be going king e2 and trying to move your king all the way into the center to block some of the opposing king's escape squares. The king's main job is to be safe, usually. You want to make your pieces keep your king safe, and you want to use your pieces to make the other person's king less safe. That's until you are out of pieces. This is an opening. Oh, sorry, not an opening. This is an endgame. You can tell because there's no other pieces. It's just kings and pawns. And at this point in the game, your king is very valuable. A pawn can only move 2 squares diagonally or 1 square forward, sometimes 2 squares forward, while a king can move everywhere. Well, not everywhere, but the king can move to 8 squares. Yeah, 8 squares, sorry. The king can move to 8 squares at any time, making it much more powerful than a pawn during the endgame, especially since you don't have any bishops, knights, and rooks left. It's much more valuable then because there's nothing to checkmate it. Usually. It's very rare that you get a checkmate in the endgame, except for by promoting your pawn to a queen. So king to d7, black's trying to activate his king, while white's is already much more active. g6, c5, they're both trying to... During a pawn endgame, like this, where it's not actually balanced, you have 3 pawns here, 3 pawns here. Black has 4 pawns here. Black has 4 pawns here and 2 pawns here. It's important that you understand that you need to push the pawns where you have a chance to promote. You're not going to promote a 3-on-4 majority. You're going to promote a 3-on-2 majority. So here, white's pushing to c5 and black's pushing to g6, both trying to move their pawns forward. There is a few exceptions to when you should move forward, and that's g4 here. G4 here is important because you don't want to allow black... Basically, you both want to move your majorities forward, but if your move costs the opponent more than 1 move to deal with it, then it's worth it because you're gaining extra moves. So g4 stops f5 going into f4, and then if you recapture, it's going to be a quite simple push forward. It'll already turn into a 2-on-1 on these squares. So it's important that white plays g4 to stop that and at least delay him with a little bit. It'll delay him a little bit, especially because g4 is really good as the king is covering e5. So if g4, after g4, which happens here, if white plays f5, the king can take on e5. If he plays h5, the pawn can recapture. If the g-pawn recaptures, then the f-pawn can never move forward, or the e-pawn falls. So it's important to understand that g4 is basically getting rid of, well, the f-pawn is never moving, but this makes it so that the h-pawn can't move either. So it's just a powerful move. King to e7 is a nice move, trying to bring the king over to the side where his pawns are going to be pushing. If he can go here, here, moving his king forward, then it's going to help with his pawns, because a king is basically more than a pawn at this point. a4, a6, c6, b6. So here it's good to know that b6 actually slows down white, otherwise than this would, because if you capture, then king can go b6, a6, and then 1, 2, 3 moves until he promotes. Here, white has to go c7, and then you can just go king d7 to stop him from promoting. So b5 takes, and then f5. So you can recapture, g-pawn recaptures, and you take on e5. So here, white's more active king. Well, white's king was clearly more active here because his king is already in the opponent's side of the board, while black's king is barely developed past his starting square. So from here, white's trading his more developed king for a few extra pawns, and this makes the game much easier. So they do get to this kind of weird standoff where both sides have a queen, but white's up a pawn. So basically white's goal here is to either A, promote the f-pawn, which is usually rare, or B, force a way to trade queens. Because if you can force trade queens and you're in a position where your pawn can promote, you're going to win. But here actually, funnily enough, black ran out of checks and the f-pawn was able to promote. So, I'm sorry, I don't think it's analyzed from here, but king h7, queen h4 check, king g7, queen d4 check. Oh, sorry, there's no check here. There's no check that black can do, so their best move is queen d4, stopping this. And then queen h7, and then apparently queen d4 check is the best move here. What happens if queen h4? Probably king g8. King g8 is a good move here because there is no more checks. Except for queen c4 check, which I missed. But you can play f7. So it really helps you because your goal is to promote this pawn. So if you move the pawn forward, you're doing good. King b4 is said to be the best move, and that's because if you were to move your queen with a check, white can promote. So this game is ended here. So let's recap quickly. Bishops are better at long range. They're good when there's play on both sides of the board. The board is very open and they can zip around capturing pawns. Knights are better when the position's closed. It's difficult to maneuver because knights are very good at maneuvering. They're also very good against pawn weaknesses. So if you have doubled pawns, a knight is very good at exploiting that, while a bishop might have trouble because bishops can only attack their colored squares. Rooks are very nice on the 2nd and 7th rank. Let me just reset this. Rooks are very good on the 2nd and 7th ranks because that's where pawns usually are. And they're very bad directly behind pawns because that traps them to just covering a pawn. It's better to defend from the side as if you have a rook. Rooks are even very good if there's if there's 2 or 3 pawns in a row, then rooks are very good because they can guarantee you capture one. Next. Rooks, sometimes it's important to trade pawns for more active pieces so that you can capture pawns in a couple turns. Like here where you gain a very quick advantage very easily. It's also important, and then in the next ones, it's always important to have more than one piece in the attack. Your queen is a very important attacker and not a very good defender. So if you're up material, if you're attacking, it's important to keep pieces on the board. If you're if you're defending, it's important to trade off your attackers and hopefully trade queens. And that's again here, same thing. And lastly, kings should be kept basically in a corner for most of the game until the end game, where since there's no pieces left to checkmate them, they can act as very powerful. They can act very powerfully to capture pieces. Thanks for watching. This episode was a bit more work than usual, so thanks for sticking through it. I know it's a bit longer than usual. If you want a video about pawns and how useful they are and how to use them, do make sure to comment below. This video took me more effort than usual, so Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I hope you learned something. This was your chess friend saying goodbye.